Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. And with me is Diane Lalonde, a Research Associate with the Learning Network at the Center as well. And the rest of our team are in other locations, all participating in this webinar. We welcome you all to Trauma-Informed Approaches. Actually, I'm going to start that again. Intersectional trauma-informed approaches to human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, Northeastern Ontario. Wherever you are on Turtle Island today, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. As settlers, we commit to making the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular, to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country. Today, the webinar comes from the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub. Our presenters are Brenda, Quenneville, and Gina, Snooks. And we're going to introduce them more formally in a few minutes, but we just wanted to let you know that our total registrations for today surpassed 1,800. So I think it says to us how important an issue this is. And we're really pleased that people are making time in their day, and in particular to our speakers who've prepared for this workshop today and are going to lead us in our learning. We want to talk about the instructions first, and I invite everybody to pay attention because we always find that this is the part that's the hardest, and we get lots of questions at the beginning of the webinar, but we're going to try and share it with you all up front. So the format for the webinar is to hear from Brenda and Gina for up to 1 hour. And during their presentation, we invite you, as always, to type in any comments or questions for the speakers that you may have. And you just enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And during the last 15 minutes of the webinar, all the questions that Diane and I will have recorded, we'll present them to our presenters, and they will respond to as many of them as they can. At the end of the webinar, and this is a really important point, in the chat box, you will see a link that Sarah's going to paste there. And this link takes you to the evaluation for today's webinar. And we really count on your input. It helps us plan and informs the next webinars in our series. And when you complete the evaluation, a screen will come up where you can enter your full name and email address. And if you do that, then a certificate of attendance will be generated and emailed to you. I just want to stress that when you give your name and email, that is only linked to the certificate of attendance. It's not linked in any way to what you've written in your evaluation. Those are all completely anonymous. And thanks to the generosity of our presenters, there's slides that you have a link to already that you can print. So that will be ease for you as you go through the webinar, but also they'll be posted on our website. And in about 2 to 3 days, Sarah Mohammed will make sure also that the actual recording of this webinar is available on the website. And we'll post the wonderful handout that Brenda and Gina also prepared. I'm holding it up, that you'll want to be able to refer back to as well. So on that note, all the instructions and the dry stuff is over, and we're going to now introduce our amazing speakers. Brenda Quenneville is co-director and the founding member of the Northeastern Ontario Research Alliance on Human Trafficking. She teaches part-time for Nipissing University's social work program, focusing on structural and interpersonal violence. She provides individual and group counseling to people with lived experience of various traumas, trauma-focused clinical supervision to social workers and psychotherapists seeking to develop their trauma lens, and a variety of support services to agencies exposed to organizational vicarious trauma through her private practice, Centered Fire Counseling and Consulting. Gina Snooks is a research assistant with NORAHT and a PhD candidate in women's studies and feminist research at Western University. So it's really special for us to have Gina with us. And even though she's not located on campus that much anymore, it's still very special for us. Her research focuses on trauma and healing practices, and she sits on the board of directors for Girls Inc. of Northern Alberta in Fort McMurray, Alberta. And with that, we are welcoming you. And if you could hear, we are all clapping as we welcome you. And we're going to now mute ourselves and turn the presentation over to you, Brenda and Gina.
Thank you. Maybe we can get to the next slide. Thank you. So miigwech, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to share our thoughts with you today. They really are our thoughts. They're based on theory, related trauma practice, and listening to those with lived experience and those who are providing direct service practice. We really see our work as the bridge, that gap, that tries to bridge that gap between trauma and intersectional theory and practice to the practice on the ground. There are strengths to this position and perspective as it allows us to step back from the work on the ground and reflect on services and programs and how they might meet or miss the needs of persons with lived experience of human trafficking. The drawback is that we can't say that this is tested best practice, but we would be really quite interested if you were to reflect on the concepts that we present today and let us know how they relate positively or negatively with the work that you are doing on the ground. That being said, we wanted to start with thanking all of you for your work and the care and concern that you have regarding this issue and those who are impacted by it. We assume that you're tuning into this webinar to get some ideas on how you could think about or approach your work in another way. For that, we applaud you. We know how difficult and sometimes very vulnerable it can feel to reflect and perhaps critique our own work. And we really hope that our thoughts and musings are examples to spark new avenues for you to explore. We also really hope to give you lots to think about. So maybe you'll want to return to our presentation slides later. So with that in mind, we do have a lot of information on them, which can be a bit much when we're going through them today. But we also know that the presentation is being recorded and that you have access to our slides and our handouts. So we hope that in this way, there will be some tools with some meat on them for you to help to return to later. Throughout our presentation as well, we're going to use the term service providers. And we really want to clarify that we use that term in quite a broad manner and include peers with lived experience in human trafficking, sex work alliances, grassroots and professional practitioners within this term. We believe that we all play an important role in this work and that we can all benefit from reflecting upon our practices. So we are NORAHT, the Northeastern Ontario Research Alliance on Human Trafficking. Our work is located primarily in Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, and specifically the Nipissing First Nation. It's also known as North Bay. I'm Brenda Quenneville. I'm the original founder of this Research Alliance back in 2013, and this is Gina Snooks. She joined our team in 2016 as our doctoral research assistant. She's presenting from Fort McMurray, Treaty 8 territory, traditional territory of the Cree, Métis, and Dene peoples. We are both settlers. So when we speak about Indigenous experiences, and approaches to trauma and healing, we're not drawing on personal experience, and we do not presume to speak for Indigenous persons. Rather, we draw on the knowledge shared by the Anishinaabe Kwe elder, Donna Basage, who guided our practices, our Indigenous partners, and decolonizing trauma discourse more broadly. So going back to 2013, at that time, I was the executive director of Amelia Rising Sexual Assault Center of Nipissing. We were seeing additional complexities in some of our clients, and we had heard some anecdotal rumors in our community about human trafficking. I wanted to create programming for this population, but I knew that I just didn't have enough knowledge about human trafficking, about how human trafficking played out, what the needs were, or really anything to ensure that the programming I created would meet their needs. And I certainly did not want to create something that would risk further harm, even if it would have been unintentional. I called on some of my allies in the community, in the academic world, and in the Indigenous Service Provision allies, and together we created NORAHT. NORAHT is funded through a SSHRC research partnership grant that allowed us to travel across Northeastern Ontario a few different times and to speak with people with lived experience, their families, service providers, and other interested allies to gather information on how human trafficking unfolds in our region and how we can best respond. For more information about our research and our partnered organizations, please visit our website on this slide. So now that you know who we are, and we would be really interested in learning a little bit about you. So perhaps you can continue to share on the chat. I saw that some people were already doing that earlier, about who you are, what sort of organization you work with, and where you're located.
So we want to move on to just briefly discuss what it is we hope that you'll take away from this webinar. Our goal in this webinar is to unpack some of the concepts that shape our analysis and to offer insight into how we can apply these concepts into our work. In short, we hope our discussion today will prompt you to critically examine your own practices. So 3 key ideas that we hope you'll take away from this webinar. 1, do no harm. The goal of intersectional trauma-informed practices is to cause no further harm. 2, although the idea is to cause no further harm, we know that it does happen, right? So most of us know this in theory, and we strive to adhere to it in practices, but sometimes we do cause harm unintentionally. 3, ongoing critical analysis is key to identifying and addressing harmful practices. That is honest and thoughtful examination of our practices and ideas. This includes personal and experiential, organizational, and societal practices. So let's start with a question. Why is it important to practice intersectional trauma-informed practices? The simple answer is because persons with lived experiences have told us that strategies to address human trafficking can be re-traumatizing and can cause more harm than they do good. Applying trauma-informed care in practices requires ongoing critical analysis of service providers' personal biases and worldviews, organizational practices and procedures, as well as an analysis of how cultural, social, and political ideas shape what we know about trauma and healing. Trauma-informed practices also require that we be willing to admit when our practices may unintentionally cause harm, so that we can move forward in a non-harmful way, or at least in a way that causes the least harm. With that in mind, throughout this webinar, we pose questions to prompt critical reflection on your personal and organizational positions. And we ask you to consider those positions within the context of broader social, cultural, and political factors. These questions are intended to prompt you to consider how your own identities and experiences shape your work as an anti-human trafficking advocate. Since we have limited time today, we've included these questions in your handout, and we hope that you will take some time after this webinar to further explore your position. So we wanted to start with a poll. Here we have the question, have you ever encountered or suspected human trafficking? And the answers, your answer choices are yes, I have definitely encountered human trafficking. 2, yes, I have suspected human trafficking. 3, no, I have not encountered human trafficking. And 4, I don't know. So if you want to take a few moments just to answer that, that would be wonderful. I'm going to see if I can move this poll off the middle of my screen. There we go. So in 2019, NORAHT conducted a survey to gauge which research outputs that service providers in our region considered to be their biggest priorities at this time. One question that we asked is a question that we're asking you here. Have you ever encountered or suspected human trafficking? In response, sorry, there should be another slide coming up there. There we go, sorry about that. In response, 43.75% indicated that they have definitely encountered human trafficking, whereas only 6.25% responded, I don't know. These responses are significantly different from the responses we heard when we conducted our baseline survey during the initial stages of our research project, when 61% of respondents indicated that they lacked any confidence or ability to identify trafficked persons. From this, we can surmise that awareness about human trafficking is growing. But of course, we need more than an awareness. We need strategies to address it. But we also need to remember that human trafficking is a human rights issue, and therefore strategies to address human trafficking must consider the human impact and must respect human dignity.
We found that defining human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation to be a challenge in and of itself. The legal definition identifies that 3 domains must be met: the act, the means, and the purpose. But what if the experience just doesn't line up with this definition? For example, it quickly became evident in our research that human trafficking is a highly subjective experience, where the individual experience doesn't readily match up with objective indicators like the act, the means, and the purpose. A title that we found more helpful came from conversations with the Sex Workers Alliance of Sex Workers Alliance Network of Sudbury, Swans, who called human trafficking rape trafficking, which highlights the presence of coercion and the absence of consent. Still, what one person may call trafficking, another may not, and this poses a significant challenge in research and in practice, and is one that we heard about quite frequently. For example, we heard service providers say that trafficked people may not see their experience or situation as being trafficking. And in fact, there's been a request for us to give ideas on how service providers may be able to convince people that their experience is trafficking. Sadly, as an extension of this situation, we heard also how service providers may then unintentionally fall into victim blaming, saying that a person with lived experience isn't ready because of the difference in labeling experience. On the other hand, we also heard from persons with lived experience say, 1, how frustrating and infuriating it can be for others to define their own experience for them. Or conversely, 2, we also heard that some people with lived experience were unable to convince service providers that their situation was human trafficking, thereby warranting their help. Either way, we see the difficulty in defining human trafficking and the problematic tensions that it creates, and suggest that perhaps we sidestep the definition for a moment and consider work from an understanding that human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation is at the core a subjective experience. This isn't to say that there can't be conversations about identifying or screening for trafficking, but we suggest perhaps taking great care in reflecting on this issue. Part of being a trauma-informed practitioner is acknowledging when our help is helpful and when it may be harmful. For example, myself, as a professional social worker with no lived experience, I would not be helpful in saying, I think you're being trafficked. I could say, perhaps, I would really like to be helpful for you. Is there anything that I can do to make this day better for you? On the other hand, we heard how people who were considered peers, so other people who have lived experience of trafficking or persons who are involved in sex work, that they were better positioned to more directly broach the issue of definition, likely because peers have more social and emotional credibility. We have heard that a peer can say, that guy is not your boyfriend, he's your pimp. Peers are an important part of the collaborative network for anti-human trafficking work. So, what does human trafficking and sexual exploitation look like in Northeastern Ontario? There's no simple answer to this question. Human trafficking happens in many different ways, which is part of the reason why it's so hard to address the issue. There's no one pathway, no one group of traffickers, and no one way of defining the experience. We found in our research was that for service providers to adopt one view will inevitably leave someone out because people define their own experiences in different ways.
So we're all familiar with the statement, everyone is entitled to an opinion. But we also want folks to consider the statement, your rights end where others begin. What do we mean by this? We are aware that we each understand human trafficking through our own lenses, which are shaped by our own experiences and beliefs. But our own opinions are not more important than respecting the experiences of persons with lived experience, as well as respecting others' human rights, human dignity, and right to self-determination. So the voices of persons with lived experience should be at the front of the movement to address human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Further to that point, we also want to point out that although each experience is unique, research does identify similar patterns and themes. And we also want to point out that research indicates that various approaches are necessary to addressing human trafficking, including trauma-informed, harm reduction, and culturally competent approaches. Pardon me one moment. Intersectional trauma-informed approaches take into consideration the factors and personal experiences are at once unique and interconnected to broader social structures, including structures of oppression. Intersectional approaches name and analyze these intersecting points. Personal factors might include gender, sexuality, trauma. This might be personal, intergenerational, or historical trauma. Experiences of poverty and/or access to resources. Access to support systems such as family and community, and one's spiritual beliefs and/or cultural practices. I should have done that a long time ago. Social structures are systems of social, political, and economic organization. The question then is, how do these fit together in relation to the different points of oppression that people experience? Settler colonialism, which is an ongoing structure rather than a one-time event, is a prime example. Simply by being here on this land, we are all experiencing settler colonialism, but in different ways. As an example, for Indigenous people, settler colonialism is inseparable from systemic racism. And for Indigenous women, settler colonialism, systemic racism, and sexism are inseparable. And an intersectional approach takes into consideration how these overlapping oppressions influence people's lived experiences, including experiences of human trafficking, as well as their reactions to trauma. These various intersecting forms of oppression are embedded in our social structures to the point that we don't always recognize how pervasive they are within these systems, such as the legal system, educational system, healthcare, and service provision. In terms of service provision, our goal is to understand how these varied points of oppression overlap and interconnect in the context of the whole story of human trafficking. So let's just pause for a moment to think about these concepts in a practical manner. Let's pause for a moment of critical reflection. The first question we want to ask is, what motivates you to do this work? And the second question we'd like to ask is, how might your own identity and lived experiences inform your ideas about human trafficking and how you do your work? These questions are in your handout, so we won't pause for too long here, but we do encourage you to keep these questions in mind and to return to them after the webinar. In a nutshell, trauma-informed approaches understand that trauma is multifaceted, are attentive to the context, that is to say, the whole story, approach trauma and healing through each person's unique perspective and lived experiences, and promote self-determination, and avoid causing further harm. Throughout our research, we have repeatedly heard, and we would agree, that trauma-informed approaches means doing the work with kindness and compassion in ways that support human rights, human dignity, and self-determination. And it means understanding the whole story. That is to say, the context in which trauma and healing occur. We believe that most service providers know this intuitively and do their best to respect others' human dignity. But even our best intentions may cause unintended harm to others, which is why critically reflecting on our practices is an ongoing practice. It's an ongoing process. This includes reflecting on our organizational practices as well as cultural and societal views. Simply put, we need to understand what the context is. And for that, we need to really listen and understand what the person is telling us about their experience. Because as we have mentioned, no two experiences are exactly the same. And we need to understand how people have been impacted by what is happening from a physical, emotional, psychological, behavioral, community, and spiritual point of view. In the context of Northeastern Ontario, NORAHT began this research project to better understand human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation in our region, because we know there are unique challenges to providing services and supports in the North. A primary objective of our research is to determine which services currently exist and where there are gaps. For example, the isolation and underservicing of rural and remote communities, the presence of Francophone communities, and diverse Indigenous communities, both urban and First Nation communities, all play a role in addressing human trafficking in our region. To that point, there is a growing awareness of the need to include Indigenous and decolonial paradigms in trauma theory and practices. However, it is often overlooked that indigeneity is not a single experience. And we cannot assume that all Indigenous people personally experience trauma in the exact same way and will want the same supports on their healing journeys. This is true regardless of a person's ethnicity and/or cultural background. Likewise, someone living in an urban center may have access to services that do not exist in rural communities, such as safe and affordable public transportation. As an example from our research, one of the tools that service providers suggested would be useful in supporting persons who have been trafficked are service maps for each community. In short, a service map is a reference that would outline services and resources available in communities so that service providers can refer to the map and determine which organization can best meet the needs of the person seeking support. For example, if a person is living with addictions, that person may require different supports than a person who doesn't share that struggle. This fits with trauma-informed approaches because it means there is less likelihood of folks being shuffled around from organization to organization, and reduces the amount of times that they have to retell their story in order to get support, which we know can be re-traumatizing. But in one of our smaller communities, service providers told us that a service map would not be useful at all because services are so limited that they know which services are available and how to connect with one another. More broadly speaking, we advocate that it is important that service providers avoid replicating similar strategies that traffickers use to coerce and manipulate persons, such as behavioral modification tactics, because these strategies can cause harm. So a couple of important questions to consider. Do your programs promote self-determination by supporting women to determine their own needs? Or are your programs designed on an assumption that service providers know how to best support persons who have been trafficked? Does accessing your services require action on the part of the person who has been trafficked, such as mandatory participation in programs or curfews at shelters? What happens if they cannot meet those expectations? We understand that organizations must have policies and procedures in place, and we are not suggesting that you abandon all rules. However, since the point of trauma-informed approaches is to cause no further harm, or at least to cause the least amount of harm, it is important to assess how our practices might be causing unintended harm by replicating the behaviors of traffickers. In these examples, we can think how folks might feel manipulated and how they might feel they have no choice in what happens in their lives, which links back to the way traffickers exercise control over people. So common themes found in trauma-informed approaches include human rights approaches, avoid causing further harm or minimal harm, awareness of trauma, again, that is to say the whole story, strengths-based, which means the individual's strengths, and of course with that we want to think about resiliency, safety and trustworthiness, and cultural safety. Our approach expands on these themes.
So we suggest that intersectional trauma-informed approaches for anti-human trafficking work in Northeastern Ontario has these three thematic components that overlap and are multidimensional in their own right. So relational approaches consider how this work impacts us on a personal level within ourselves and the interpersonal relationships with people with lived experience and who we are providing service to. It also recognizes how that therapeutic relationship is influenced by organizational mandates, policies, and practices. It also recognizes how organizations are part of larger systems in culture and society, all influencing intersectional and trauma-informed practice. Self-determination and agency is rooted in harm reduction and feminist trauma discourse. Strategies aim to empower people to lead their own healing journeys supported by service providers. It challenges us to really meet people where they're at on their own journey, from defining their own experience and how they choose to move through it, and supporting them, even if it's not a choice that we would make for them. Decolonial is the awareness that trauma has physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual aspects that are shaped by unique personal experiences and intersecting structural phenomenon, as well as social, cultural, and political ideas. Awareness that contemporary trauma discourse is largely grounded in Eurocentric, biomedical, and psychological paradigms that may not meet the needs of people across all cultures. So we use the term reaction in place of symptom or disorder as an act of resistance to pathologizing conceptualizations which risk victim blaming. Instead, we believe that reactions and resulting adaptations are to be expected as a result of exposure to traumatic events or situations. To be trauma-informed, one needs to consider trauma from a multitude of perspectives and theories: neurobiology of trauma, attachment theory, cognitive theories, somatic-based theories, impact of culture and colonization, intersectional theories, structural, soul wounds, the list goes on. We've included a handout called Trauma Reactions and Adaptations as a tool to help you connect with a large variety of ways in which trauma may manifest. Though our list is pretty comprehensive, it is not exhaustive, and highlights how multifaceted trauma-informed work really is, and how we're only beginning to understand its complexities. So I'm going to offer some brief examples under each theme, but the handout will give you some more ideas. In terms of spiritual, we might see a change in sense of self, a change in worldview, intergenerational trauma, soul wounds, isolation and social disconnection, disconnection with purpose and place in creation, loss of ability to co-regulate with safe others, living dead, and depersonalization and derealization. I just realized that my slides are mixed up. Good. So in terms of physical, we see blood memory. Physical sensations may trigger how we're feeling. So there might be hyperarousal, constriction, bracing, chronic pain, heart issues, hypoarousal, spaciness, numbing, shallow breathing. There can be sensitivity to light and sound, changes to libido. In terms of emotional reactions, we might see feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, shame, feeling blank and hollow, rage, abrupt mood swings, limited or inability to identify emotions or broad range of emotions, and an altered sense of ability to love, nurture, or bond with safe others. Behaviorally, we might see people who are distrustful. We might see some of the behaviors associated with avoidant attachment behaviors. So like withdrawing, isolating, increased need for control, possible increase in rigidity. Anxious attachment behaviors, we might see that manifesting as reassurance seeking, trying to please others, need for constant contact, fear of abandonment. We might see hypervigilance with safety. We might see self-fulfilling prophecies related to negative schemas and cognitive distortions that are shaped by our attachment patterns. We might see substance use as a means to cope with trauma reactions, helpless behaviors and active passivity, attraction to dangerous situations and activities. Finally, with the cognitive and psychological impacts and reactions, we might see dissociation, splitting, and advanced compartmentalization. We might see memory gaps, negative schemas, cognitive distortions. They may not seem rational as the frontal cortex may not be fully engaged. There may be a narrowed window of tolerance for distress for everyday stressors that are perceived as insurmountable or personal attacks. There might be difficulty identifying and meeting needs, and they might have an external locus of control. So to take a relational approach to human trafficking, it is imperative to understand the intersectional position of the person with whom you are connecting with. For example, in Northern Ontario, Northeastern Ontario, there are high rates of poverty, marginalization, isolation, and colonization. We've heard multiple times that there are social, emotional, and economic gaps that are prevalent in Western capitalist societies that are the same ones that are exploited by traffickers. Dr. Brenda Restuhl is a psychologist and CEO of the First Persons Wellness Circle for Nipissing First Nation. She shared with us how at one time Indigenous communities were very close-knit with a wide community circle caring for each other. Colonization and the introduction of individualism, patriarchy, capitalism changed these communities, adding in addictions to cope with intergenerational trauma and colonization. Indigenous communities have been fractured. She shared that people now they don't know what's happening in the community. Social roles and relationships have changed, creating feuding amongst families. There's less sharing of food, knowledge, or practices. People are no longer caring for each other, and this creates opportunities for traffickers to exploit. We heard similar narratives amongst non-Indigenous persons too, about the lack of connection. We suggest then that a highly relational approach be taken to foster this connection. This is called a therapeutic alliance, and in trauma work, a therapeutic alliance requires attention to our own trauma reactions and countertransferences, attunement, and containment. Trauma theories help us to understand how trauma might be impacting the persons who we are providing services to, but we also need to be well informed of how we ourselves are impacted by our attitudes, bias, or position, and maybe consciously or subconsciously impacting our relationship. For example, do you believe that all sex work is exploitive? Though we don't want to get into this debate specifically, it is helpful to, as an example, to highlight how it could impact a relational approach in the context of human trafficking. We have learned that traffickers will work again to isolate people that they are trafficking, in part by fracturing possible future relationships with service providers by saying things like, they don't understand what we're doing, or maybe the opposite, no one will care about you because you have sex for money. Or they might use some narrative anywhere in the middle. Whatever the narrative is, the stage has been set for the person experiencing trafficking to expect to be treated in a way that others them, that sets them apart. The stage has been set. And what we know from trauma, in order to protect themselves, they might be hypersensitive to any indicator that their suspicions are true. So we as service providers need to be aware of this if we are to take a relational approach, because it will influence the relationship, whether service providers try to successfully bracket it or not. Authenticity is the key to relational approaches. People with lived experience told us that they can tell immediately if a person is being authentic or not. So there may be some issues like this one that we brought up that you might want to really think through in order to make an intersectional, trauma-informed approach, because we really do not want to reinforce any of the narratives that traffickers use to isolate people. We need to prove those traffickers wrong. So our job as trauma-informed practitioners, again, is to create a setting rooted in awareness of our own multifaceted trauma reactions and countertransferences, and how they may influence attunement while providing effective containment. So to help in this, again, is to reflect upon our own reactions and experiences, and we offer some questions for you to think about. Why am I drawn to doing this work? Am I feeling authentic in all of my strengths and shortcomings? How do I hold my own fears while maintaining an effective container for the people that I provide service to? Do I feel I have allies in my community who are willing to help in doing this work? Sometimes we can feel really alone in this work. How do I see myself? Am I a hero? What do I fantasize about? I'm going to offer this small bit of self-disclosure to help pull these concepts to the forefront a little more. So while I was working with people in continued crisis and subjected to ongoing violence at the Sexual Assault Center, from time to time, I would notice myself having vivid revenge fantasies, usually about successfully confronting and intimidating perpetrators of violence. As I unpacked these fantasies more, I realized that they were most prominent when I was feeling vulnerable, or that my own sense of agency or my perception of safety was threatened. These fantasies were a really important clue about the anxieties myself and my clients were holding. Perhaps there was some projection of wanting protection from me for my clients, but they're looking to me to help protect them. In turn, it might be how I was feeling ineffective and overwhelmed and unable to help more in my work. These revenge fantasies allowed me to connect with my own sense of agency to help mitigate my anxiety. So on the one hand, fantasies like this can be helpful. However, they can also be very dangerous. Had I not contained and worked through these fantasies in supervision, they could very easily have spilled into my work, consciously or subconsciously, jeopardizing the safety of my clients, my coworkers, my organization, and myself. Service providers working with human trafficking are exposed to very difficult realities and need support in mitigating the impact of them, and have a right to trauma-focused supervision. Knowing how complicated and multifaceted trauma reactions and adaptations are when we consider them as attributed to the persons with lived experience for whom we're providing service, we also must consider how trauma is impacting our own experience as service providers within that interpersonal relationship. These trauma reactions and countertransferential issues and experiences directly impact our ability to attune to the person with lived experience in the present moment. So attunement is a concept that's present in many Indigenous-based healing modalities around the world, as well as in attachment theory and transpersonal psychology, and likely other Eurocentric models as well. The idea is to be connected with another's nonverbal communication so that you're able to respond empathically and energetically with what they're saying or not saying. When we are stressed or activated with our own trauma reactions, compounded by countertransferences, we can't attune, so we can't respond appropriately and can be perceived as inauthentic or untrustworthy. Containment is not the same as confinement. When I'm talking about containment, I think about it from a spiritual, physical, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive or psychological perspective. Understanding the multifaceted and complex reactions to trauma, we need to be able to use ourselves to provide containment. So spiritually, I do use my own energy and spirit to connect with whatever anchors me. And if possible, I will send that energy out to stabilize the energy in the room. So if people around me are highly activated, I will do my best to use my voice, my body, and energy to project a calm energy within myself and into the room. Physical, I'm in private practice, so I set up my office space with very special attention to how the physical space feels in terms of comfort and safety. I make sure that people can't hear what we're talking about. I dress in a way that doesn't set us apart or emphasize hierarchy. Emotionally, I need to be calm. I can't be reactive. I think of myself as an anchor for a boat. The boat may be being tossed and thrown in the waves, but I am doing what I can with my calm yet engaged emotions and my energetic field to be anchored in place and to hold steady. I even tell myself in my own mind when I feel myself slipping, hold steady, hold steady. Behaviorally, I need to be consistent. I need to be reliable. I need to identify the limits of my boundaries in a way that my work won't swallow me up, but also does not trigger any reactions of abandonment. I also need to be fully aware of how I can help and when my help is not helpful. And that's a hard one. I'm sure it will be hard for everyone that is listening to this, but we need to know, how do I help and how might I harm by accident? We hope that this webinar is really helping you in this. Cognitively, again, I need to be calm so that I can use my frontal cortex. I need to recognize when I'm being triggered, to know how to ground myself really quickly, and I can't get swept in the stormy waves because I need to be that anchor.
So moving on to self-determination and agency. Agency is defined as the capacity to act. This links to human dignity and respecting that folks are the experts of their own experiences and that they have the capacity to make their own choices. We are not suggesting that persons who have been trafficked have made that choice. Rather, we are emphasizing that it is important to listen to folks when they tell us what they need and how we can support them on their journey forward. This is important also when we think about programming and how programs are designed, what the expected outcomes are, and how resources are allocated. So just a few brief statements with that. We need to understand, again, that each person is the expert of their own experiences and that they have the capacity to determine their own needs. This means working alongside persons who are being or who have been trafficked and walking with them on their journeys as opposed to determining their journeys for them. It means acknowledging the autonomy of each human being. And for Indigenous peoples, this further includes returning Indigenous peoples' inherent rights bestowed by Creator.
We believe that consent should be informed, enthusiastic, and continuous. And this is not just in sexual relationships, but also in consent to participate in our programming as well. From our understanding, from lived experience, many did not know the bigger picture that they were being drawn into when they were being lured into trafficking or when they were engaging into trafficking. Again, there were narratives that the traffickers would use to draw the person in, and certainly the true expectations and outcomes were not disclosed. We suggest that an intersectional trauma-informed approach would not replicate this pattern of non-disclosure of expectations and outcomes. Therefore, we advocate for informed, enthusiastic, and continuous consent for participation in our programming. And here's some thoughts to consider. If there's a programming or personal expectation that a person not engage in sex work, there can be a possibility for challenge. We know from the literature and from the lived experience accounts that we've talked with that there is often a back and forth or ongoing involvement in sex work that makes it difficult, if not impossible, to meet the implicit or explicit expectation to not engage in sex work. What we have learned is that when a person is in this back and forth involvement or continued involvement, that they feel the need to hide this from their service providers, which creates a barrier to both a relational approach and it does undermine the concept of self-determination and agency. It means that a fracture has been formed that could be avoided. Our concern is that it is precisely these fractures that traffickers exploit. It is one that perhaps is avoidable by adapting personal and organizational views to embrace sex work alliances so that should the client choose to stay in sex work or if they choose to leave, that they will be supported unconditionally either way. This way the relationship remains intact, leaving less possibility for the trafficker to fracture. We also understand that funding for programming often requires some sort of tangible outcome measure, And counting all the people who exit sex work might be an enticing one to include. We wonder instead about these problematic outcome measures if less tangible, relationally driven outcomes could be articulated. For example, maybe the number of meaningful contacts, perhaps with the person with lived experience reaching out to the program, which indicates trust. These are just some thoughts. Turning now to program approaches, specifically rescue. Well, again, we recognize that there's a lot of debate about the rescue and exit model in working with this population. And again, we don't want to get into this debate, but what we do want to share is a couple of things. So first, we heard that more than one example of women and family members reaching out, asking for help and rescue who did not receive it. It was ultimately up to the sex workers, the aunties, and the informal community supports to get them out. We also heard about concerns about discrimination and racism within formal service provider organizations. We see this as directly linked to the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, particularly when help to exit is explicitly requested but denied. We can't tell if this is an issue that manifests in our region because of the high Indigenous population here, but we do know that the lack of services available, making options for these discriminated against even more inaccessible. Addressing colonization and racism within our systems of care is critically important work in anti-human trafficking work in Northeastern Ontario. Further, we ask that if someone is asking for rescue, please rescue them. Second, for those who are not asking for rescue, a rescue approach could put them more at risk. We heard from lived experience that a trafficker, once they thought that someone on the outside was expressing concern, there was a quick and dramatic escalation of violence for the person involved. It made more problems for that person with lived experience than it did to help. Also, when we look back at the handout of trauma reactions and adaptations, we suggest that perhaps we as service providers need to help safeguard or instill a sense of agency and self-determination within those that we are working with to help anchor themselves, to get through what they're experiencing. Without it, psychologically speaking, there's a risk of collapse into helplessness and further trauma. We may need to work to instill this agency and self-determination wherever possible. We want to be clear though, we are not advocating for a position like, well, you're choosing this, which is wildly patronizing and really unhelpful. Instead, we are advocating for connecting a person to their inner resource of resilience, agency, and self-determination, perhaps helping to brainstorm options with the clear message that whatever they decide, that they have your full support. And this may mean continued engagement in sex work. In this case, we can see how a program outcome goal to exit from sex work may not be aligned with the goals and needs of the person with whom you're working with. This point creates a particular challenge in resource-starved Northeastern Ontario, where a person with lived experience does not have the same choices for service provision that their counterparts may have in Southern Ontario. So, if they go to an organization for help and the outcome goals or service provider expectations don't line up with their own needs or decisions, they could be out of options. Perhaps for service providers in more resource-rich areas, they can take an active stance regarding sex work, either pro or con. But up here, I'm not so sure that we have the same luxury. We think that this might mean that service providers in Northeastern Ontario have to be more flexible and have a willingness to have the person with lived experience take the lead in defining their own experience and their needs. Further, it's important to add that if you're noticing in yourself a compelled need to rescue, please seek trauma-focused supervision, because it could be a trauma reaction or a countertransference issue like my revenge fantasies, and you might need some more support for this very, very difficult work.
So moving on to decolonial approaches to service provision. Decolonial approaches to service provision are connected to the broader decolonizing movement. Thus, decolonial practices are attentive to the impact of settler colonialism and its ongoing effects. In particular, decolonial approaches are attentive to the ways in which decolonial ideas are embedded in personal, organizational, and societal ideas about trauma and healing. Sometimes unknowingly, because these practices have been embedded in our systems and structures for so long that they've become quote unquote norm. In fact, one of the mechanisms of settler colonialism is to overwrite the sacred stories and knowledges of Indigenous people. Therefore, decolonial approaches to service provision work to decenter colonial stories and ways of knowing, and to create space for Indigenous ways of knowing. To summarize decolonial approaches, they unsettle Eurocentric paradigms, make space for multiple ways of knowing, recognize the impact of colonialism, including trauma and healing practices, and they're rooted in holistic paradigms. Decolonial approaches to service provision is not simply about adding Indigenous-focused resources to existing practices. And it is not merely the responsibility of Indigenous peoples to decolonize trauma practices. Rather, it is about changing the way that we approach trauma and healing and shifting the value we place on certain modalities above others. That is what we mean when we say decolonial approaches make space for multiple ways of knowing. So in terms of holistic paradigms, what are holistic paradigms? Well, just like other paradigms, holistic paradigms are not one single approach, but there are common themes, including understanding that there are spiritual and cultural, physical, emotional, behavior, and cognitive, as well as psychological dimensions to trauma and healing, and that these various aspects are interconnected and inseparable, which is what we've been discussing throughout this webinar. In the diagram you see here, in the circles beyond the center are various holistic modalities. As you can see, these modalities move beyond dominant Eurocentric, biomedical, psychoanalytical modalities. Moving beyond these strategies is precisely the point of decolonial practices. But that is not to suggest that these commonly used practices are not useful at all. In fact, oftentimes, holistic approaches can be used alongside these common modalities. So for example, psychotherapy and ceremony can be complementary practices rather than being perceived as contrasting ways of healing. This is an example of making space for multiple ways of knowing in which one modality is not considered better than the other. Likewise, expressive arts such as photography, dance, pottery can be utilized as part of the process of understanding traumatic experiences. This is because the creative process itself can allow us to grapple with the ways in which traumatic experiences affect our sense of self without actually having to name those experiences per se, which in turn can be cathartic, empowering, and healing. The point we wish to emphasize here is that Eurocentric paradigms may not meet the needs of folks across diverse cultures and diverse worldviews because, as Dr. Peter Dunn writes, quote, many mainstream human service practices are seen as hierarchical, non-inclusive, and oppressive. In contrast, critical holistic theory recognizes that the roots of many social problems include colonization, racism, ableism, homophobia, and inequality, end quote. As we've already mentioned, one of the mechanisms of settler colonialism is to erode Indigenous knowledges. In the context of our work, we emphasize the Indigenous knowledges of the First Peoples of Northeastern Ontario because that's where our work takes place. And that's why we have placed Indigenous practices in Turtle Island at the top of our diagram. However, it is important to keep in mind that there are many diverse cultures Indigenous cultures across Canada who may share similar experiences and cosmologies, yet also are very unique in their own ways. Also, we need to keep in mind that colonial strategies have destroyed and/or eroded Indigenous knowledges and practices around the world. Decolonial trauma practices therefore include the revival and/or reclaiming of traditional practices for the purpose of healing and empowerment.
I'm just, Gina and Brenda, it's about 5 or 6 after 2, so if we could just wind down because we have many questions.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we cannot assume that trauma theory and practices can be applied universally, and this means that we need to create space for multiple ways of knowing to coexist in order to best meet the needs of the people that we're supporting in a way that aligns with their worldview. And it might mean integrating traditional healing practices into psychotherapy and counseling by honoring Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing without appropriation. Service providers may be open to the idea that multiple healing modalities can coexist, and the best approach for someone who is healing from trauma may be to integrate these multiple approaches. Dr. Brenda Restool, again, she shared some really helpful insights with us about how we might bridge the gap between Eurocentric therapeutic modalities and Indigenous healing. And she suggests that building an understanding of soul wounds, blood memory, intergenerational trauma, as well as the ability to articulate the ongoing process of colonization. She also suggested that some Eurocentric psychological approaches are more compatible to traditional healing Indigenous modalities, naming positive psychology, psychodynamic approaches, Jung theories, logotherapy, and meaning making in particular. I'm going to jump to the next slide, Gina. So finally, we really want to acknowledge that intersectional trauma-informed practice requires its own container, and that's trauma-informed programming, organizations, and systems. After all, the people with lived experience have shared that the systems are often traumatizing. So we make the following suggestions for programming and organizational systems. Trauma-focused supervision to help with the interpersonal aspects of relational approaches to help contain the anxieties related to self-determined and agency-focused approach, and to help foster the ongoing personal journey of decolonizing practice. We often heard of toxic work environments and ask people to consider if perhaps the issue is actually organizational vicarious trauma. As staff are exposed to traumatic material, if that's not contained, then it spills out into their person, their work environment, and the entire organization with similar trauma reactions and adaptations that we looked at earlier. So in Walker 2004 said that in some organizations, secrecy, collusion, and splitting become an intrinsic aspect of the relationships, and practitioners are left feeling inherently unsafe, unprotected, and undervalued. And this is organizational vicarious trauma. Third, we advocate for working with sex work alliances for all the reasons and issues that we discussed in this presentation. And finally, along the same line, we advocate for collaboration with all sorts of organizations wherever possible, as well as working to decolonize programming, organizations, and systems. So this brings us to our end, and we really wanted to thank Western University and the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children Learning Network and Knowledge Hub for this really great opportunity. Miigwech for all the persons with lived experience and family service providers and family members that we have spoken to who grounded our work. Miigwech to our partner organizations, the Union of Ontario Indians, Anishinaabeg Nation, and Elder Donna DeBasage. Nipissing University, the AIDS Committee of North Bay and Area, Victim Services of Nipissing, and Amelia Rising.
Thank you to both of you on behalf of all of our participants. And we have so many questions, I'm going to just move right into them. And just to share with our participants that our apologies, but we never are able to get to all of the questions. So please don't interpret it as anything personal if your question doesn't get addressed, but we'll do as much as we can. The first one, please provide an example of how an agency or organization's policies can replicate the behaviors of traffickers.
Well, some of the things that we talked about in the presentation is that we really have to understand the narratives that are used. And so a simple example is, well, one that comes to my mind pretty readily is that, that behavioral approach. So we know that traffickers will say, if you do X, you'll get Y, or if you do A, you'll avoid B. And if we have programming that that says, well, you have to attend 3 sessions before you get a bus pass, or whatever it might be, that same kind of behavioral approach, it's still behavioral, like it's still the same sort of, the same way of interacting that limits a person's agency and self-determination. It really, it can feel the same way. So we really have to understand and think deeply about some of those narratives that traffickers are using that we know, and really then look at it in terms of our organizational policies. Like, am I wishing that they're going to leave sex work and that's my ultimate goal, but I'm not articulating that at the upfront? Well, that's the same as what traffickers do, that I'm going to get her to engage in this relationship, but I'm not going to tell her what my final outcome is. And so the same thing, if we're not saying that right at the outset, then we are creating these reenactments, or these opportunities for reenactments. And that's really problematic. And we hear all the time about how our systems are traumatizing, and this could be part of that.
I think those concrete examples are really helpful in explaining and bringing to life what you were trying to help us understand. Another question was, what is blood memory?
Well, blood memory, when we think about, we can think about that in terms of intergenerational trauma. And we can also see that in Western ideas of epigenetics. So trauma actually changes our DNA. And so when it's passed on then to our offspring, then we can see that's been called intergenerational trauma for many, many, many centuries. But it's only now that Western science is starting to go like, oh, did you know that you can actually pass on trauma through blood and that blood memory and that DNA? So, I mean, you can look at it in the Western point of view or the Indigenous one, but the Indigenous folks have been saying that for a very, very long time. Gina, I hope that I'm not.
That's perfect. Yeah, that's perfect.
Jump in anywhere.
Do you have any examples of trauma responsive housing or shelter models for people who've experienced trafficking in your area, or from your knowledge generally, your experience?
That is a really good question. We have a serious gap in Northeastern Ontario in terms of that. I'd want to really sit down and think about it, so it's not one that I can really speak to off the cuff. Gina, I don't know if you have something.
No, I can't really speak to that either. All I can say is that, you know, coming out of our research, that is definitely a concern that many folks that participated in our sessions also had concerns with, right? One of the top things was we need specific housing for folks that have been, have experienced trafficking. And one of the things for communities in the North, it was important to recognize that these services, including specific housing, needs to be in the North, closer to folks' communities, because sometimes there's an added stress when we send people away.
Right.
We did also hear, sorry, from when we were talking with Swans before, we talked with them for like talked with them many times, but is the need for a place to be able to go to decompress.
Yeah. And
so I think that would look perhaps different than a shelter system. I'm not really sure, but I suspect that the sex work alliances that are out there would be a really great resource to chat with and try to understand, because they know what's needed, and other people with lived experience, of course.
Another, taking a question in a different direction, and this might be our last one just in terms of our time, because we have to honor our 1:15 for all of the participants. But one of the participants says it's sometimes challenging for service providers to quickly ground themselves when responding to trauma reactions in the people they are working with.
Hell yeah.
What can they do or say in those moments?
I think for myself, it's something that you need to practice before you even are before you're in the situation. So learning how to ground yourself, and so you know kind of a go-to. I often will like kind of have my hands like this, and I'm pinching kind of the inside of my palm, and that physical sensation helps me just be like, you're here, you're right now. Like I say, I have that mantra in my head where I'm like, hold steady, hold steady. I'm picturing myself as that anchor, and things are blowing all over the place, and I'm just like, hold steady, Brenda, hold steady, you know. And I think it's something that, those are the things that I do. I think that it's something that we need to practice. But if that also, I think, is a really important part of role of having support around you, is that it can get to that point, and that's happened for me too, where you can't actually ground or calm at the end of the day. And that's a sign that maybe there's something more happening in terms of needing a break. And it's okay to need a break, because this is really, really hard work.
Yes, yes.
And there's a organizational component that needs to be there as well. I think that our organizations need to understand trauma and the impact of trauma, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, organizational vicarious trauma, because we need our organizations to provide that containment for us. And when that's not there, how in the world are practitioners supposed to be able to ground and root and do the things that they need to do if they in turn are not contained?
And finally, and maybe we'll gather the other questions and send them to you. And if there's responses, we can post those on our website if that seems appropriate. But we'll just conclude with, is there a helpline for human traffic survivors?
I think there is a new national, isn't there?
I'm not sure if it's launched, but yeah, I think so, Brenda. And I don't know the number off the top of my head either. I'm sorry, that's something we probably should have anticipated and prepared for.
No, what it gives us is important homework to do, and we will track that down and make sure that that's made available to everybody. Someone has just posted the number. So it's
Thank you.
In the chat box. There was also a wonderful suggestion, somebody who sits on the sexual assault response team, SART committee in Kitchener-Waterloo, just talking about the care path for survivors of sexual exploitation in the Waterloo region. And in the chat box, so don't leave till you scroll through and copy that link if you're interested in looking at some of those care paths that they have documented. I wish we had more time, perhaps another time. It would be wonderful just to talk more with both of you, but we want to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and for the work that you have and are continuing to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you to everyone who tuned in.
Yeah.